or no?
Oh, you can keep going. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because we'll edit it. Would you like Brian to read the host intro, or would you like me to do that, Brian, since you have a cold?
I think I can read it
Cool.
because I made a few notes too.
Okay.
But at some point, you can read me pretty well. Feel free to kind of step in if you want. Yeah, I'm ready whenever you all are.
All right.
Great.
Say the word.
Okay. Welcome back to IA on the Hill, a look at government affairs and advocacy issues impacting the market research, insights, and analytics industry. I'm Brian Lamar. I'm the Senior Director of Network Quality for ROI Rocket. Andrew Deciles is joining me today. He's the Head of Client Development and Research Services at ROI. Hello, Andrew.
Brian, how are you?
Doing great. Today we're diving into a topic that I'm real excited about, although it sounds bureaucratic, but it really touches every aspect of how government works, which you know I'm a big fan of. I know you are as well. Federal research policy, not as boring as it sounds. It's actually a really fun topic. So questions like why can't a federal agency run a simple survey without waiting a year for approval? We've been through that ourselves many times, Andrew. You've experienced that quite a bit based upon just me working with you. What's stopping innovation and how we gather data from Americans. The census always has issues and it's controversial. Um, Joining us is the one and only expert. Um, if you're not a member of Insights Association, it's worth the membership just to get access to him. Joining us is Howard Fienberg. He is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy at the Insights Association. And he's here to answer a lot of those questions. And Andrew and I will try to stump him over the next hour or so. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brian, and I appreciate you guys coming together.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're here to break down the association's latest comments on the Office of Management and Budget. That you had some comments and you can find them online. We could probably link that in the show notes, which I read pretty thoroughly and they're pretty impressive. And why modernizing these rules matters for public trust, data, and smart policy. But maybe Andrew, maybe start us off with what is some background. Maybe ask Howard a couple of questions around the background.
Yeah, let's start right at the top. Yeah, so what is the Office of Management and Budget, Howard?
So it is a White House executive branch office. That is where all of the, as it says in the name, the budgeting. So they put together budget requests and track budgeting and spending for the entire federal government. However, there is a section of it that is dedicated to research. So primarily thanks to the Paperwork Reduction Act, which originally was passed in the 80s and 90s, that set limits on how the government could contact and talk to members of the public. It was designed to prevent too much respondent burden. And they weren't thinking just of research. They were thinking of any kind of data collection, like forms, of which there are a gajillion of them in the federal government all the time. Some are voluntary, some mandatory. And so it covered that entire spectrum. But as they realized it extended to research, and that was sort of vaguely part of the PRA, they built up a chief statistician's office within OMB, and OMB developed its own guidelines for statistical practice and research practice. And of course, the most recent iteration of that came in 2006, and they haven't really looked at it again ever since because nothing's changed since 2006, right?
Certainly nothing in online sample, right? An online
Well,
survey
the world's the
results.
same
No
as it
new tools.
was.
Yeah.
The world is the same
Um,
as it was in 2006.
Before we dive into that 2006 policy and your comments that you most recently did, could you give some examples of like what types of research the OMB would be conducting? Like why would they do a survey, right?
So it's not OMB doing the survey, and I'm glad you asked that. So to help clarify for everybody, this is OMB serving as the Uber regulator for how research is conducted and approval, the approval mechanism for research across the entire federal government. So any federal agency, department, subgroup, whatever it is, they want to do a study of any form, pretty much anything over, hitting more than 10 people. they need to talk to OMB and put in a request for approval for their data collection. And that is a significant burden on those agencies that they have to go through. And that is, how you get into OMB being, the focus of our comments. Because OMB put out a request for comment on regulations that could impede business. It's a very broad request as they're trying to look at regulatory burden across the federal government. And we thought that this was a good opportunity to tie back not just how this impacts, how OMB rules not just impact research by the federal government, but how business is impacted by those rules, because we are a part of this too.
So you're telling me that when I'm doing research for the Department of Health, the Department of Housing, the FDA, something like that, and there's an IRB that we have to get through, they're also going to the OMB for
Correct.
additional approval and oversight.
Correct. So, that agency, they have whole sets and teams of people, usually highly paid statisticians, but not necessarily, whose, a good portion of their job is putting together these, approval requests and submitting them into a system at the Office of Management and Budget, where they sit for a long time. And eventually someone might look at them and so that long time, we've been told that's a minimum of 9 months in that system before it's really reviewed. And then, maybe you get approved within a year if you're lucky. And that's so regardless of the size of the study and its complexity, it goes into that filing cabinet, if you will. And there are examiners at OMB, basically just federal bureaucrats. They are not schooled in research, as far as we know.
Mhm.
They're not statisticians, they're not researchers, nor are they, experts in the different fields that these agencies work in. So, if the VA is trying to get a survey of veterans approved by OMB, they're not going through a person that knows the veterans community or knows the needs on either side of the stakeholders that are being dealt with, nor the agency. So it creates this entire fantastic bureaucratic maw that you have to get through in order to eventually, hopefully, get a survey approved.
Wow. Well, we can spare the listeners any tangents on government efficiency, and my thoughts are your thoughts on that particular process. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that 2006 policy?
So it's a pretty extensive document that they clearly, I don't know exactly how long it was in the works, but I suspect for probably at least 5 years, given how a lot of government documents like that work, putting together an entire guide to statistical practice for federal agencies and departments. The the setup there is covering everything from how you put together the sample, what kind of methods and methodology you should choose, the mode of research, even mentioned, although in a limited fashion, of incentivizing research subjects, how to report results, how to keep track of the quality. Uh, it's a really extensive tome. Plus, because they realized that it's a very extensive document, they came up with more targeted guidance with questions and answers to get into more of the practical uses of that policy. And they even made reference at one point that this is something that should be revisited, and the OMB would be open to discussing changes, but that really hasn't happened.
I mean, it makes sense that such a thing would exist, and it's probably good for researchers and for our industry because the government does have, some deep pockets. They conduct a lot of research, both themselves as well as in collaboration with companies who are our clients and who we're familiar with. Um, but of course, if they started working on it in 2001, there may be a lot in there about, mail surveys and more phone surveys, and certainly nothing documented in there about, like survey routers and the new technologies that we have. The sample industry has, of course, completely evolved since then. Is there anything that stands out to you, and this is perhaps part of your comments, um, that stands out to you in that document as like particularly outdated or problematic?
Well, that's a long list. But so the fact that there was not a requirement to come back and revisit, I think is the most glaring issue. Because again, like you pointed out, it's a document focused on research via mail, in person, and telephone. The only mention of using the internet was as, sort of vaguely you were back in the mode of really the 90s when you had to provide you had to provide people computers in order to ensure that they could have internet access and could participate online. Because when they were drafting this, a good portion of the population wasn't online. But now, of course, times have changed. And on that alone, you're dealing with a world where when they started this, very few people were online. Now, not only is everyone basically online, they have multiple devices and ways of accessing the internet, usually at high speeds. And we don't track internet access anymore per se. We're in the business of tracking broadband access and the question of how fast everyone's connection is, not whether they have a connection at all. So the world has changed on its access since they started putting together that policy, and they haven't really considered changing it since.
And how does that outdated policy affect like real world government decision making?
So the end piece comes to the government has to spend a lot of time, and time is money. And time is paying people to work on something. It has to spend a lot of resources that comes from taxpayers to grind through this process, which was originally designed to protect respondents, to protect the taxpayer. It is instead creating more waste in the process of grinding through and trying to get through hoops to get something approved that may or may not benefit the taxpayer in the end. So they're not looking at the return on investment of a particular data collection. They're looking at very blinkered sense of what is respondent burden. And they don't take into account another aspect of respondent burden, which we've complained to OMB about for years, which is harassment. Because of response rate demands that the government puts in there, and basically the government demands response rates for their surveys, usually anywhere from 70 to 80%, and they think that's normal. And in order to try to achieve that kind of response rate, it means that researchers doing federal data collection are having to do not just a few callbacks and a few contacts, they're doing dozens. And if it's by phone, when you're trying to reach a research subject, you are calling multiple times a day, every day. And that's bordering on harassment. And the impact that that has on the taxpayer and the research subject is pretty brutal, but it also has a spillover impact on everyone in the insights industry because we're also trying to contact those research subjects also. And we're trying to treat them with respect, hopefully, and treat them with care, be mindful of their time, mindful of their attention. In the meantime, they are getting abused by federal data collection by design of government rules. And so the design of government rules is hurting our ability to contact research subjects.
I keep getting angrier and angrier the more you talk, Howard. I could do a whole rant on just the response rate. I was part of a committee to try to help APOR redefine what response rates are, given modern technologies to how we take surveys and how respondents get to a survey with more modern technology. It's really hard to measure that. Um, and so there's not a strong opinion from the APOR as far as I know about how to measure that, but I'll digress because more importantly, when I think of this as a researcher, and maybe I'm naive, this does not seem like a partisan issue. This, you would think that anyone in the federal government, if they wanted to get feedback from people, residents, or whomever it is, they'd want to do it as fast as possible and as agile as possible. And just the one problem you mentioned, it could take a year to get approval. Imagine that during COVID. Before COVID, it takes a year to get. I mean, the world was completely different a year later, right? It's a whole different set
Mhm.
of questions and feedback and what you want to learn from people. Has there been? I guess this is a long way to say. Has there been other attempts to rectify these challenges, or is this just small potatoes in the gigantic gazillion-dollar federal bureaucracy that exists?
There have been attempts. So, actually, at the Insights Association, we were talking mostly with congressional staff in, I guess, 2017, 2018, on the House Oversight Committee about trying to fix these rules. And they were looking at it from like going back and rewriting the law, in addition to working with OMB to try to get them on the same page. Yeah, but and they weren't just looking at it, to be fair, from the standpoint of research. They were looking at it from the standpoint of all the data collection. Because again, the PRA deals with all these every form and function that the federal government is trying to do, including just simple forms that are demanded by like USDA from a farmer for participation in certain projects. So it runs a really wide gamut of stakeholders. Uh, Getting agreement from everybody would have been complicated, to be fair, and there will be complications in trying to update this broader statistical policy. But I think it has to happen. I think that this administration at least has the possibility, more than others that we've dealt with, that they might actually look at it and decide that it's time to revisit and reform it because they can see the spillover effect into the taxpayer resources, that this costs money that they shouldn't have to spend. And I think that's what's going to make it move because
And so
we're
why,
trying to find a way for them to save money.
yeah, is that why now? Right? Because 2006 was a long time ago. Why are they asking for comment now?
Well, they were asking comments about everything across the spectrum, regulation wise, not just this. They were asking
Mm.
about every function of the federal government, regulations across every sector and every agency. We have taken this opportunity to focus them back on themselves because I'm quite confident that no one at the top of OMB has thought about the PRA and statistical policy. It's just this doesn't come up as a major issue for most people. It's a bubbling under the surface issue for agency heads, including when my old boss, Chris Cox, when he went to the Securities and Exchange Commission, one of the first things we talked about when I came to the Insights Association, it's a long time ago now, he said, "So can you go fix the PRA for us finally? Because this is ridiculous." So and for him, he wanted to do a survey of maybe a dozen, 2 dozen stakeholders, stockbrokers, and and couldn't do it, and securities associations couldn't do it because he was wanted to talk to too many people. We would have to do it one to one very quietly. So getting a official data collection was driving him up the wall. He's not alone in that. It just happens to be one of the few conversations that I've had because I knew him. But this is the kind of thing that, if it gets momentum, could really make major change.
Do you have any other good examples of like good research, important research, sort of dying on the vine?
Not great, but I don't have examples to share at the moment. I'm not that good. But as you can see, I mean, look, if the minimum is 9 months, and you highlighted COVID as an example, if you were putting together a survey last year, or let's say you're putting together a survey in 2023, you're probably still asking COVID-19 related questions. If it took you a year or more to get it, yeah, and you're getting it out into the field, then so that's just approval. You get it out into the field, maybe 2025 by the time you're done with this survey that you designed and put into the system for approval in 2023. You have in it a question about something that no one is focused on anymore. It's of no relevance to policymakers. You're annoying the research subject who doesn't care to talk about it anymore, most likely. You're wasting their time. You're throwing money out the window.
So all the research projects that are currently in queue, none of them know that Donald Trump is president. They don't even know the mix of policymakers.
Correct. Now, most federal research studies aren't focused on, that sort of thing, but
Sure.
yes. But that's exactly the same kind of point. The focus and interest of a lot of the research that is in the queue is probably already out of date as far as this administration is concerned. And they would look at it through a different lens and say, that's garbage, we don't care,
Mm.
and delete, which will help clear out the queue, but it doesn't help all the time and money that's been wasted with that research sitting in the queue.
How frustrating is this? When I'm reading this, I just get more and more frustrated because you're talking about things that seem archaic in some ways. Um, Trust of online panels, frowned upon using them, high response rates, probability panels, lack of innovation in surveys. And we obviously have a lot of problems and challenges in the private sector with research. Um, but I feel like that the private sector could come in and just really clean up a lot of this pretty quickly if allowed to. Is that what you're recommending doing, or is this kind of a baby step approach?
No, that is part of it. So in the baby step, which a lot of agencies have already gone down the road of, is probability-based panels, which they make a slight nod to in their statistical policy in 2006, but only slight. And that is something, it has made it through the approval process for a variety of agencies. It's used by a bunch of agencies. We have a variety of different companies and nonprofits in our industry, at least half dozen that already provide that to federal agencies right now with probability-based panels, very high quality, makes people very happy, and it's meeting the needs of and demands that the OMB had set already. So even within their arcane structure, a probability-based panel can meet the need for a
Hmm.
fraction of the cost of the other modes and methods that they are suggesting in the statistical policy that someone should still go through. So at the moment, they could just a slight nod could be turned into, no, this is a reliable way to approach this. You should consider it. That would change the ballgame in a lot of ways for federal research. But it is just the starting point because there is a built-in, not just a bias towards probability-based research, but a complete dismissal of anything that is not
Right,
probability-based.
right.
So
Yeah.
the concept that you could focus on statistical representativeness rather than, the probability based around an entire population, uh, they're not ready for that yet because it's so far in the past. Even they weren't ready for it then. And a lot of folks in our industry were still hesitant about it at the time.
Mhm.
But those folks are definitely a minority at this point. And a focus on representative research done in any mode or manner that fits the needs of a study is something that they should be recommending at this point because the research is conducted that way everywhere else in this world except for the federal government.
Mhm.
And it's done that way not just because people are, silly and willy-nilly. It's because, people are focused on the return on investment because they care about the impact on the research subject. They care about the overall cost of the study and what it's going to be able to accomplish and how quickly. So they're not focused on trying to spend a year or two trying to get something perfect. They want to get something that works. And we want to help them get to that point.
Mm.
That's what we want to help the federal government get to is a research policy that works, that is flexible depending on the needs of a research study, that is not going to waste a ton of taxpayer resources, not bother research subjects that don't need to be bothered. yeah, and deals with them in a matter of respect that respects their time and that respects their attention.
I'm curious when I'm talking to clients about research design, I talk a lot about risk. And so you would design the research differently if someone's going to invest $1 billion in a new factory, right, and build something. The research might look differently versus just taking the next step to explore. Are there examples of high risk research in government? Maybe I'm not thinking through, but it feels like it's a lot of public opinion. It's a lot of um, low risk research. So, isn't it strengthen the case to kind of expedite a lot of this stuff so that we could just get the opinions back within a year? Um, or am I foolish in saying that?
No, and again, there are little nods to that within the statistical policy that differentiates between the risk levels and the how high value and difficult to reach the target audience is. And that's something that they really only focus on when it comes to incentives, because of course OMB frowns upon the use of incentives. They don't think it's really useful except when you absolutely most desperately need to reach a particular target audience, rather than in, again, the broader world where it's a standard thing. There are risk involved studies. Majority of them are not, but there are some when you get into more sensitive information. If the research that you're doing overlaps with medical issues, with with detailed financial issues, it requires a certain greater care, and there's more risk involved with how you handle that information. But a lot of that, see, the data handling policy is separate for the most part from the statistical policy. That's something that is set by different laws within the federal government already, and it's quite restrictive. So there should be a mechanism by which it's not just about the sensitivity of the research, but yeah, that is one piece to be considered. And if it's a small population that you're trying to hit, to make sure that you're not, exposing the information of those people too much during the course of the study because you're hitting such a small population. Those are considerations that perhaps should go into it. But a majority of the research that the federal government does outside of the strictly medical field, it's just not that high risk.
You said
I'm
something
sorry, I
real.
should clarify the one of the areas though that does come up, and that is asking people about victimization, drug use,
Yeah,
criminal activity, more sensitive.
yeah,
And certainly you need to treat that as much more high risk, and especially if it's going to take a lot more care to make sure that you are getting accurate information in a protected fashion from vulnerable groups. And that should certainly be something that is very specifically protected in the course of the statistical policy.
cool.
So I want to circle back to something that you said, which is that the policy and the OMB frown on the use of incentives. That is something that runs, entirely counter to how those of us in the space are sourcing respondents. Um, do you have any insight into why that was originally introduced, and why that might be a sticking point? Because it seems to me like almost all data collection methods now would require some type of incentivization of respondent, at least those that we're using in kind of a modern private sector world. So is every research project fighting that policy, but in having to, advocate for the use of incentivization? And why in the world was that, written into the policy originally?
So I think the OMB recognized something that actually butted up against in Congress in the last decade, where some members of Congress looked at the use of incentives in surveys and freaked out about it because it looked to them like bribery. So I think that is where the origin of this is, the idea that someone's going to be paid for their information. It looks unseemly from a certain angle. So I think that's the origin of it. But OMB doesn't. So OMB frowns on it, but they frown on it in the broader sense that they also think it's not only not necessary, but that it isn't really uh, prevalent either, which doesn't make sense in the broader spectrum, but it also doesn't make sense in the federal government because tons of federal government surveys use incentives because they have to. Now, in order to get them approved, that's an extra set of hurdles that you have to go through at OMB. And they effectively put caps on how much you can provide in an incentive, which are not written into the policy. They just are developed by the OMB examiners, as far as we understand. And each one kind of has their own cap that they came up with, and those may vary depending on which agency they're dealing with. So this is all arbitrary information, and if it was all set across the federal government, it'd be much easier for us to fight against and try to get them to change. But it's all an informal, behind the scenes black box, which makes it much worse. But the reality is a cap of $40 to $70. All right, the OMB looks at that and says, well, that's very generous. But it depends on the kind of research, the kind of target that you're after. Uh, the idea that you would be restricted in paying bus fare for someone who is on welfare and trying to hold down a job, and you want them to come to an in-person interview. The idea that you'd put an arbitrary cap on the incentive you can offer them, your ability to pay for bus fare for that person and for a little bit of their time
Mhm.
when they are barely making ends meet.
Mhm.
Minor increase in the incentive makes a huge difference in that research subject's ability to participate and willingness to participate again, because a lot of these surveys are
Yeah.
ongoing and they want to, longitudinal studies, they want to track someone over time. How are you going to get a research subject to agree to that? It's crazy. And people's time is valuable.
Yeah, and we live in a world as well where the data collection method itself, the incentivization itself, the source of the respondent itself are all going to bias the data in some way, right? Because we can't magically ask everyone in the entire country a question in some, you in totally neutral way of their preference. And so, it seems to me that the asterisk of among people who were willing to participate in this research for free,
Mhm.
right,
Yes,
would introduce more bias than, you know, among people who have volunteered to participate in market research, which is the asterisk that goes behind every single study that we conduct, right?
absolutely.
Um,
And
yeah, that's just so interesting.
yeah, and you're in a complicated situation. So there is not enough research on research. One of my favorite things, yeah, research on research and benchmarking in the industry on the use of incentives. There's just not enough. I mean, I referenced a study in the comments. They were sort of the best thing
Mhm.
I could find about the prevalence of incentives. And yeah, within that study, of which it's hard to say how representative necessarily it is, but 98% of the research subjects said that they had received incentives for participating in studies, and most of them emphasized that that was one of the reasons, one of the important reasons as to why they participated. Now, there are lots of other reasons for someone to participate in a research study, but that is one that helps secure them. It secures their participation. Uh, and we need to get to a point where OMB can recognize that, all right, yeah, we're offering, subjects in this particular study, it's not horribly intrusive. It's not going to take them a ton of time. We're offering them $15. It's not a big deal compared to the amount of money that the federal government is going to waste while this survey sits on the vine and we try to find other ways to get people to participate in the study and get a representative sample. Or we can just spend the $15 to incentivize that person and it'll come off magically. We'll save a lot of time. We'll save a lot of money. It's the same concept we have to that folks in the industry sometimes have to deal with clients when you're discussing incentivizing, because not
Mm.
everybody wants to look, not everybody wants to hand out value that way.
Mhm.
but it's
Yeah.
part of a broader equation. And I think that's what the federal government is not really recognizing at this point.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah, and with incentivization, like you mentioned, there's a mix of motivations why someone would participate. And I think that it's naive to say that someone is participating only for the incentive, because incentivization, whether it's $1 for a 2-minute survey to someone, just their opinion as a consumer, or $500 to an ophthalmologist, right? In all of those situations, like the $500 to the ophthalmologist, they're doing it because they think it's interesting and they want their opinion to be known. They'd make more money doing another surgery during that hour, you know? And so the objection around incentivization as a like methodological issue, I think at this point it's just table stakes because people know that you can get paid to participate in research. So why would they do it for free?
well,
It's tough. Go ahead,
I'm
Brian.
I would say I'm happy to testify in front of Congress if you'd like us to talk about this and all the research we've done on these topics. Uh, be my dream.
Well, it's definitely something. This is something that has to be, I think, just run
Yeah,
through the regulatory process and through OMB itself. Because rewriting the Paperwork Reduction Act to get specifics on research is just not feasible. I mean, rewriting any law at this point is a very Herculean task.
yeah.
It's just
Well,
political realities.
uh, am I fair in saying that in the current laws that are set up for doing government research, those that are most impacted are small businesses because they don't have the resources to do government research and to kind of put up with this bureaucracy. And the ones that are set up to do it are larger that have hired former government employees that know how to work the system. And that really hurts small businesses. Is that a fair statement?
That is absolutely fair, is one of the points we tried to make in the comments, that they can open up part of how they can bring greater innovation into the research space in the federal government is by, simply reforming how all of this functions would open up opportunities for a whole new set of players because
Hmm.
so our own insights and analytics report from 2024 at the Insights Association, yeah, we pegged our industry is more than $77 billion. That's a lot of insights companies out there that could potentially be doing with work with the federal government, and only a handful of them are. And they all have something to bring to the table. In the process, we are also, making the suggestion that OMB should also look at ISO as something to note in their statistical practice, not as something that is required, but that, something you can note to a federal agency, say, look, if a company has adopted the ISO for market research, you have a certain confidence in the quality of the work that they are doing and a transparency, which is not easy to get. ISO is not an easy thing to achieve for any company. It's not like every company has it, and not every company is going to want to get it because it can be a pain to get, and it's not necessary for every company. But it is something that can be useful for a federal agency trying to determine, all right, there are 7,000, insights firms now I could look at if, we open up this policy, for example. How am I going to determine who I should work with and who I shouldn't? All right, well, this guy has ISO, they've worked to the ISO standard. All right, we can give them more consideration and more easily because we have a better window into what they're doing. And I think that's something that we will need as part of this equation in order for the federal government to really trust in who they're dealing with. Because at the moment, you're right, they deal primarily with the largest companies and the largest nonprofits. And a lot of them, but there are a bunch of nonprofits that have built up specifically around providing research work to the federal government because it's its own bizarre niche work. It's
Hmm.
hard. It is extremely costly to get in on the ground and start providing and knowing your way through the intricacies. It's very difficult.
And when you say ISO, of 20252 is the one I've heard a lot this year. Is that the one you're talking about? Okay, that's
Yeah,
bottom
data
of
quality.
yeah,
It's a market research. It's market opinion and survey research, I think is the full title.
yes,
20
a lot.
20252.
Okay. I'm ready to move on to the future, Andrew, unless you have any other questions about.
No, no. I think that, Howard, when you said, because we can sit here and Brian and I have a million opinions on what, research utopia would look like. And a lot of our listeners will also have that based on, being at the cutting edge of these types of things in the private sector. But you said, okay, reforming the PRA is Herculean and like, categorically not really achievable. So what is achievable? What does a really successful reform look like?
Uh, really successful reform is going to involve us and some other stakeholders going in, sitting down with OMB and going over every one of these points and saying, all right, let's start. Yeah, and they're going to have to go through the process of completely redrafting their statistical practice guidance and the Q&A that goes with it to bring it into the 21st century, because this was written for the 20th at best. And this is doable. It's not going to be a fun glitzy process, nor as much fun as guiding a bill through Congress. But it is something that can be done and should be done, and we're going to try to make it happen.
Are there other advocates pushing this, or are we alone on the island with you as our captain?
At the Well, I mean, there are a bunch of insights companies, including some IA
Mm.
members, that are supportive of a lot of this. If not the whole thing, certainly pieces of it. And I think that it's going to get support from a lot of different quarters once people realize the opportunity that's involved here. Because I think a lot of folks across the social sciences, for example,
Mhm.
the more in academia, they haven't thought about a lot of these things much at a bigger level either. And so it presents an opportunity for them at the same time as they're helping the federal government look at this more carefully. Maybe they will. So we'll see. And I think that the advocates for taxpayers across a lot of different, the across the partisan spectrum, I think that there's a lot here that they can get on board with as well.
In the comment opening, I guess, or the request for comment, does that suggest to you that the OMB is enthusiastic, will be a very strong word. Is it on their radar that this is something that needs to be reformed, or is that something that you and others are going to have to push for so that we can even have that meeting when we're sitting down and talking about a redraft?
It's something we have to push for. And I've talked with the chief statisticians at OMB in the past who have been pretty dismissive of all of these things, including the concept that they've done anything incorrect and that they should have to update anything. As far as the chief statisticians have traditionally been concerned, it's because federal agencies didn't understand their guidance. So it was the fault of the user, not the fault of the designer. And that means that it's going to take us a little bit of push in order to get them to look at it again and take account of the user. But I'm confident that we can make some headway here.
So this may be also a silly question, but I feel like I get a text message or an email every day about like, write your congressperson about this. Is there anything that we can do as Insights Association members to help you get this done? Do we need to write a letter or call someone, or how does this work as far as moving forward and fighting for that meeting?
There will be an opportunity for that once we get OMB to focus on it, because there will have to be certain open process, and then that's the opportunity for everybody in the industry to be able to speak up and to contact OMB and say, look, here's how this works for me. Here's why you should consider this for you. So it's not that time yet, but hopefully very soon.
Okay. Well, when it is, I'm sure we can have many listeners and IA members and non-IA members alike to we'll rally the troops.
I look forward to it. But in the meantime, we'll keep plugging away on this and a ton of other issues. But
Well, well, I'll give you an opportunity for final thoughts, Howard. But I encourage any listener, if you've listened this far, you probably already read it, but read the what Howard wrote May 12th. Insights Association urges reform of federal government research policies. It's an easy read. It's lengthy, but it's very easy read and very relevant to our industry. So I really encourage that. Any final thoughts, Howard or Andrew?
nothing on my end. I really appreciate you guys taking the time. It is, again, it's a niche issue, kind of mercurial, even for our industry,
Yeah.
but it is something with a big impact on what everybody does, again, because of the spillover effects of how research subjects are treated. And there's a potentially big market for work there in the federal government if this process, this policy, if the approval setup, all of this stuff gets cleaned up, there's a lot more work for everybody, and partially just because everything can be done so much more cheaply. Everybody's going to have a
Right.
could potentially have a crack at doing some federal work. So
Yeah.
there's a lot to offer here.
Yeah. Final thoughts from me, Howard. Just thank you for all that you do out there fighting the good fight behind the scenes. The industry is obviously near and dear to all of us who work in it. So thank you for that. Thank you for talking about this issue. It definitely is startling some of the things that you've told us are imposed at the moment. And we look forward to hearing some updates on this and hopefully await that day when we can rally our support behind you.
Look forward to it too.
Awesome. That's it for today's I Am the Hill. Thank you, Andrew, for joining.
Mhm.
I echo what Andrew said about you, Howard. Thank you for everything you do for our industry. Um, Got to be a lonely job sometimes, but there's thousands of people behind you. And thanks to the Insights Association for shedding some light on this, how the outdated government can stall progress and what it'll take to modernize research for the federal government, and the people that it's supposed to serve. So for more, again, check out that press release. It's at insightsassociation.org. And until next time, I'm Brian Lamar, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you today, Howard. I'm a proud Insights Association member and supporter. And if you aren't already, reach out and join ASAP. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.